On this week's Talking Politics, the new problems in Britain and France's effort to control migration.
The mechanics of the French, in cooperation with the British, working out on French soil whether these people really have a right to come to the UK, that is not going to be easy.
How we could all be carrying identity cards sooner than you think.
It will be controversial.
Yeah.
Lots of civil liberties campaigners will worry about it.
Do you think this is something the government is seriously considering?
No, this is stuff, to be clear, that I know the government is working on at a rate of knots.
And why all parties need to get real on the economy.
At some point, we need grown-up politicians who tell voters the truth. People just think tomorrow never comes, but it is coming.
Welcome to the show. I'm Tom Bradby.
And I'm Robert Peston.
And there are many very serious and important things, obviously, to discuss this week. Chief amongst them, the fact that Robert was spotted in the Royal Box at Wimbledon yesterday.
Yeah, well,
Come on now.
I noticed I was spotted by News at 10.
Yes. You know what?
Among other media analysts, I thought that was... And it was very funny seeing our colleague Ian Woods taking the piss out of me on News at 10. I mean, listen, I had the time of my life. It's an incredible privilege to be invited to watch Wimbledon from that vantage point.
I'm still waiting for my invitation.
No,
I'm just saying. You know, I'm fine about it.
Well, I took my colleague from the Peston show, Vicky Flynn. I'll take you next time.
Oh, Robert, I'm touched. It's only a matter of time until it's Sir Robert Peston. That's all I'm saying. You know,
I think hell is like to freeze over before that happens. To be perfectly honest, but I mean, so look, you and I, we are incredibly lucky people to do jobs we enjoy and get invited to amazing things like that. I have to say, as somebody who has been over the years invited to some astonishing sort of sporting and other events, this one is so special. And the reason for it is that it's so relaxed. I mean, I don't think I'm giving away any great secrets here, but the people who work in the Royal Box are all members of the armed forces, and I have to say they are so lovely and so interesting. I don't know. It is just it's a very unusually, because sometimes when you do these so-called swanky things, you feel a bit I don't know, they're a bit stiff and a bit formal. Nothing like that. I mean, it is just an amazing sporting event. So watching the tennis, we happen to see two fantastic matches, is in itself such a privilege. But just the whole ambiance, you know, the food's amazing, the people are amazing. No, I genuinely, it's very rare that I allow myself to just have fun, and I just had fun.
Well, very, very good. I'm very pleased. You had such a good time, he says through gritted teeth. You don't need to apologise. We all know how hard you work.
Actually, I'm going to digress just for one second. They did offer me something I've literally never in my life had, and I took it skeptically, a glass of English-produced, alcohol-free, sparkling rosé, and I thought it would be undrinkable, and it was actually quite nice.
There are so many directions I thought this conversation was going to go, but non-alcoholic English sparkling rosé. We should give them a shout out. Come on, let's give them a shout out. What was it called? You can't remember.
The honest answer is
okay.
My mind was on other things, so I don't know. But you know, this is plainly an industry that's got lots of growth potential.
Yeah, we should probably talk about some serious stuff. Let's start with President Macron being here. And I was thinking about how to kind of frame a discussion about it. And we'll talk about the small boats in a minute, because obviously that's one of the important policy things. But it did strike me, and we've talked about this before, that it's a sort of reminder that the Brexiters, or the Brexiteers, whatever you want to call them, have done a very good job, as we've discussed before, in kind of cementing Brexit is the status quo. They obviously won the referendum, but all the opinion polls since then, or certainly recently, have suggested a lot of people the majority feel like they made the mistake, and that there would probably be a majority, at least in theory, to go back in. Whether it would evaporate in the event of another vote, I think one could debate. And yet, despite those opinion polls, there is absolutely no discussion about going back into the European Union. And I kind of, watching Macron here has been interesting to me because obviously we've traditionally, probably in recent years, been closer to the Americans than we have to the French. The American alliance, as we've discussed many times, is fractured or fracturing. Still very important, but not as reliable as it used to be, I think, in the eyes of most opinion makers and probably the public as well. So in theory, we're turning more towards Europe, and France is a more important ally. But it doesn't necessarily feel to me like that's the reality. I don't look at President Macron here and think, well, the French are now our closest allies. But I wondered, before we got into the talking about the specifics and the policy matters, I wondered what you thought of the mood music.
There's no question that in the round, relations between Starmer, his colleagues, and European Union leaders, obviously including the President of France, are just way better than the relationship that the preceding Tory prime ministers had. I mean, to be clear, Boris Johnson's relationship with European Union leaders was disastrous. I mean, they just held him in contempt. Truss wasn't there long enough. Sunak, I have to say, did do a pretty good job of rebuilding the relationship. And he, in particular, got on exceptionally well with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. They sort of bonded over their Stamford pasts. But you know, there is literally no issue that there's been a significant further thawing under Starmer. The question around Starmer is he therefore being ambitious enough in getting a better trade deal with the EU as a result of that thawing? And I would argue, I've said on this podcast, categorically not. That the sort of food deal that he did with them is economically almost irrelevant, and they could be so much more ambitious. I thought, though, that Macron, who's a very smart politician, despite periodically making catastrophically bad decisions like dissolving his parliament all those months ago, in the face of the threat from Marine Le Pen and Jason Bardella. So in his speech to Parliament yesterday, he said something which I think not only resonates with lots of MPs, but I think resonates with the country as a whole, which is, the national interest for the UK is certainly to get nearer to France and certainly to get nearer to the EU in a world where, the big geopolitical forces are China, undoubtedly, not only an economic threat, but in many senses a very significant political threat now to, Western democracies like ours, and America, where Trump is rolling back so much of what Europeans would say are, the right way for the world to be governed, whether it's the international rule of law, whether it's free trade, So, and it just was, I felt it was quite a big moment symbolically that Macron is making what I think is an important and I think, as I say, many British people would say correct argument that it's really important that the UK and the EU and the UK and France pull together as an alternative, as I say, many would say a sane voice against the very powerful voices of Beijing and Washington.
There's no doubt every public opinion survey suggests very strongly that people want to control their own borders. They really don't like, the vast majority of people don't like seeing boatloads and boatloads of people arriving in an uncontrolled fashion. And it undermines and undercuts our immigration policy and confidence in it. obviously the Labour government came in saying they were going to smash the people gangs and all the rest of it. As far as we can see, they haven't done that. Certainly the small boats arrivals are static or increasing, in fact, this year. And that's
massively increasing.
Yeah, so that's very debilitating. I mean, obviously the weather's been very good, so that's increased it. But the truth is they're coming in pretty large numbers, and whatever the government is doing isn't working to stop them. We've talked about this before, probably many times. We've probably both been thinking about it for a number of years. We obviously watched the Rwanda policy emerge and then fade away. It's very obviously the policy they seem to be talking about now, as you've discussed on News at 10 this week, is the idea of one in, one out. We accept a genuine asylum seeker, and consequently the French agree to take people back, or a genuine asylum seeker who has family connections here. And the French therefore agree to take anyone who doesn't fall into that category back. That doesn't seem to have been agreed yet, though I'm interested to have your take on where you think that's going. But what I wanted to just say to you is that I don't think there seems to me, and lots of people listening to this may have their own solutions, but I can't see any really credible solution that doesn't involve us getting much closer to the Europeans, much more embedded with their policy generally, so that we possibly have to take a greater proportion of asylum seekers across Europe. But at least we can undercut the small boats arrivals by simply returning people to France. Do you agree that there is no possible solution that you can see that doesn't involve a great deal more European cooperation, or do you think there is such a policy?
The most rational way to deal with the migration issue is, of course, for Europe to act collectively. Collective agreement, though, almost always founders on, national sensibilities, sensitivities. You never, it's one of those classic game theory problems where what any individual nation thinks it's in its interest turns out to be collectively bad for the whole, because the national interest gets in the way of a rational group decision. So I remain, fearful that we'll never get to that rational endpoint where there's just a decision between European countries about how to distribute what will be, rising numbers of people coming to Europe for really powerful political, economic, war reasons. I mean, you've only got to see what's going on in the Middle East at the moment to be fearful that flows from the Middle East aren't going to slow down. You've only got to look at what's happening in Ukraine to be concerned that flows from Ukraine could rise again. You've only got to look at the impact of climate change on very poor economies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to realise that flows from that part of the world are very unlikely to slow down. So, the underlying trend is growing pressures from around the world, growing flows of migrants to a continent that those migrants think of as being safer, more prosperous. Now, one of the things that a collectively, rational, collective Europe would do would be, particularly when it comes to issues like the effects of desertification, basically the impact of climate change on making it much harder for people to make a living out of the land in sub-Saharan, you would just be investing way more in helping those countries mitigate the effects of climate change. British aid is being cut. The pool of money we've got to invest in parts of the world to help them adapt with, whether it's climate change or to reduce the impact of war or whatever, we're investing less. So some would say that was a very irrational decision taken by this government, although we did need to increase defence spending. It seems to me that the microcosm, as it were, of the particular deal that is being negotiated between the UK and France captures many of these paradoxes, because so let's just look at one aspect. One of the reasons that I suspect that this one in, one out deal will be agreed and announced. We're recording this on Wednesday. The results of the summit will be announced tomorrow on Thursday. I suspect we will get at least the framework of that deal. And just to, as you say, it means that between France and the UK, we would have the ability to expel back to France somebody who'd come across in a boat, so long as we took someone who, we felt had a legitimate right to be here. So they might be a family member of somebody already settled here. Before I get into some of the sort of national, tensions here between the UK and France, it is just worth thinking about what a bureaucratic nightmare that is going to be. I mean, if you just think about, you've got some migrants in France, the mechanics of the French, in cooperation with the British, working out on French soil whether these people really have a right to come to the UK, that is not going to be easy, right? This is a sort of quasi-judicial decision. So what are we going to have? Are we going to have British officials going over to France to make the decision? Are we going to trust the French to make the decision on our behalf? Is it really going to be really fast, which it would need to be for this to be an effective system, and for it to prove to the smuggling gangs that the game is up in terms of being able to offer to those who want to come to the UK some kind of guarantee that they're going to be able to stay here for a long time. And as I said, one of the short-term problems with a deal of this sort is, if it looks as though it's genuinely going to come in, there would almost certainly be a rush of migrants to try and get across the channel in the weeks before it actually is implemented. So you could see a massive spike. But the issue that I'm particularly interested in is the one raised by the French, which is what they don't want to see is, I'll rephrase that. What they want to see is, as part of this deal, a reduction in the pull factor from the UK. And they very rightly say that one of the reasons why so many migrants want to come to the UK is it is way easier to work in the UK, illegally in many cases, than it is to work in France. And that is because the labour market in France is way more highly regulated than our labour market. And secondly, everybody has to have an identity card, right? Now, one of the things which potentially would really have a significant impact on the flows of people coming to the UK would be, and actually I sort of talked about this at some detail in the last book I wrote, How to Mend Britain, would be to have to introduce an identity card. It would probably be a digital identity card, and make it almost impossible for anybody who didn't have that card to obtain any employment whatsoever. And, to that extent, you would eliminate the very, very large black market in
Can I jump
employment.
In there? Because we've been talking about identity cards our entire career. Obviously, the Blair government talked about it quite a lot. The idea has been repeatedly floated and then retracted. Where do you think this is something the government is seriously considering?
Oh, government is definitely seriously considering it.
And will they do it? And would there be the same stink about it as there has been when the idea's been raised in the past? Or do you think the public is more in the mood to think, we've got to sort these things out, all the kind of stuff you were talking about?
So, in the end, we won't know until we know. Yeah. My view would be that the climate has changed a lot, partly because of our blooming mobile phones, where we have given all of us, permission to so many organisations to know so. The main argument that people historically had against identity cards was that somehow it would allow the state to, track us, follow us, control us in all sorts of potentially pernicious ways. Well, we've given Apple and Google and, or Alphabet as they're now called, and Meta, ludicrous amounts of ability to gather information about us and know about us, and and yet we're sort of chilled about it. So, do I think that broadly an equivalent sort of essentially bit of identity that happens to have the state's branding on it would attract quite the same essentially concerns about civil liberties as was the case 15, 20 years ago? No, I don't think that. There would have to be significant checks and balances in respect of how the state used that information. But I think if you could make the case broadly that it would not only help to, as I say, reduce the black market in labour that suppresses wages, is a pull factor for asylum seekers who are, essentially just economic migrants. It would obviously be part of, part of all sorts of other improvements in services like health services, because you would probably link this kind of identity card to the NHS app, which could pull together all sorts of useful health information that would help us have speedier access. And this is stuff, to be clear, that I know the government is working on at a rate of knots. And, they will announce all of this when they feel that they've got a package and a product, to put it in simple terms, that is so obviously in most people's sort of quality of life interest.
Two quick questions then.
But it will be controversial. Yeah. Lots of civil liberties campaigners will worry about it, and lots of MPs will worry about it. So, I'm not arguing that in the end there won't be a massive furore about it, and the government will necessarily get it through. But I think that the conditions for getting it through are better than they've ever been.
Okay, two quick questions on that I think people will have. Number one, is your hunch that we might see this before the election?
Yeah,
we're definitely talking about.
Oh yeah, we're definitely going to see it in the election.
Okay,
yeah, definitely going to see it.
That's the first question.
I suspect we'll see it in the next. I don't know whether we see the full-scale obligatory identity card in the next few months. No, but we will see a pilot within the next few months.
Is it conceivable that the government might go to the next stage once it's established it and start to say, right, you can't have a social media account, for the sake of argument, without an identity card?
Well, in terms of stopping
in the UK,
in respect of policing and preventing vulnerable young people from getting addicted to some of these social media platforms, plainly. Obviously there's an issue about at what age you get your identity card, but nonetheless, plainly it would be helpful. In the end, there would be, I think, all sorts of potential uses of that sort. My own view would be that's probably an infringement of freedom of expression too far. If it was simply you couldn't have any kind of social media account once you're 18 plus without proving your identity via an identity card, I'm not sure that is within the British tradition. I'd be surprised if that happened. But do I think that it would be completely inappropriate to have a rule that said you cannot get paid employment unless you show your identity card? I think that's reasonable.
I wanted to move on to talk about one other thing today, which I've been thinking about a lot. Obviously, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which if you're listening to this or watching this and you forgotten what that is. It's the kind of, what would you describe it? The government's financial watchdog body set up by George Osborne to act as a sort of independent auditor of the government's finances, came out with a report that concluded that the British government's public finances and the British state's public finances were, in its words, relatively vulnerable, and pointed out we were near the top of the international charts on a couple of ways that we perhaps might not want to be. And it seemed to me,
I mean, just to explain what those are. Our national debt as a proportion of GDP is, which is one measure of whether we're borrowing too much. Out of the 35, 36 developed economies, our national debt is bigger than all but, I think it's 3 or 4. And the interest rate that we pay to borrow, again, out of those 35 or 36 developed economies, again, we pay. The government pays a way higher interest rate than, basically there are only about 3 or 4 other countries that pay more than we do. So on both of those measures, our public finances right now are shaky. But what was particularly worrying about the Office for Budget Responsibility's sustainability report is they say, completely rightly, that those finances are on a worsening trend. There's one other thing before we go into depth that it's important to say. The trends that the OBR point out have been strongly negative for years. It so happens that this is now Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's responsibility because they happen to be, current Chancellor, current Prime Minister. This is not, though, their fault. It's their responsibility. But the cause of all of this goes back years. You can argue they should be doing more to fix it, right? You can argue that the fiscal decisions they've taken so far are not quite the right ones, and we will discuss that, I'm sure. But, at fault is a whole succession of British governments.
And it seemed to me when I was thinking about it that there are kind of 2 things. And we've talked quite a bit about the government's fiscal rules, whether they're right or wrong, and the overall shape of the public finances before. But as I was listening to Joel talking us through the numbers last night, I was thinking 2 things seem true to me here. One, in the budget this year, Rachel Reeves is probably going to have to find some room for tax rises. But beyond that, to the medium to the long term, this government or any government that succeeds it is going to have to contemplate some very big decisions. And I thought for a lot of people sitting at home, listening to this or walking their dog or whatever they're doing, thinking about it, I guess the question I would have is, okay, well, what's likely? If I was if you and I were in the Treasury, what would we be thinking about? And I just wanted to talk through the kind of the practicalities, the politics. And so I thought I'd just kick it off with kind of throwing some ideas around and then see what thoughts you would have. The triple lock, cripplingly expensive. It just seems to me it's very, very hard to look at the trajectory of public finances without thinking that that's got to become vulnerable to change at some point. But again, if we were sitting in the Treasury discussing this, you'd have to note down likely to be extremely controversial. Pensioners have obviously limited or no room to maneuver, to take on more work or to get jobs or whatever because they're retired. So that makes the triple lock very difficult to touch. There are lots of pensioners who are relatively vulnerable economically, so that's another reason not to touch it. But it is very, very expensive. Moving the pension age seems to me another thing that, more than the government has already envisaged, seems to me another thing they're going to have to think about quite seriously. When you get to the autumn statement or the budget and what they might think about doing, I was just thinking about it. Fuel duty, do they finally go for that? But it causes such a stink. Freezing tax thresholds, it's a sneaky thing to do, but it always seems to me politically more acceptable because even though people are having money taken off them, it doesn't immediately strike people as a tax rise, even though it realistically is. I wondered what else. Wealth taxes, difficult. Potentially you've got to revalue houses. That's a very difficult and controversial thing to do. I wondered what you if you were in the Treasury, if you were Chancellor and we were having this discussion, I was your Chief Secretary of the Treasury and I was throwing out these good, bad or terrible ideas, what would you be thinking?
So look, I just need to introduce an important distinction here. And both things I'm going to say are challenging for most of us. And the distinction is between the short term and the long term. Mm-hmm. And there are massive problems for both, right? I mean, if I'm honest with you, I would take the view that the short term, i.e. what the Chancellor does in the budget, is trivially unimportant compared to the fact that we are on a seemingly inexorable trend for the national debt to go from, I don't know, it's roughly 100% of GDP at the moment, up to nearer 300% of GDP over the next 30 years if current trends continue. And those trends, I mean, you know, short of somehow persuading everybody under 50 to have 3 children almost immediately, that, you know, those trends can't be stopped. I mean, you know, in particular, one of the big drivers of the fact that spending pressures are going up and up and up is that the number of people who are older and retired relative to the working population is growing and growing and growing, which means that, you know, as you say, pension costs are rising, and the cost of the NHS is rising massively. We've got massive climate change costs, both the costs of tackling climate change and the negative impact of climate change on the, you know, on the country. There's another part of what the OBR pointed out, which actually, if I were anybody who was thinking of working at the Treasury longer than about 5 minutes, would be giving me kittens, which is because of some regulatory changes, which means that our so-called final salary pension schemes are declining in importance, and much more money is going into what are called defined contribution schemes, which are basically schemes where the money you receive as a pension depends on the performance of the investments you make. Over time, UK institutions, I won't go into the detail of why this is, but for regulatory reasons, UK institutions' appetite for buying this government's debt, for lending to the government, UK financial institutions' appetite for lending to the government is going to shrink very significantly. And unless somehow this government can persuade investors in the rest of the world to lend to them, as a result of that, what the government will have to pay to borrow, you know, when there's, you know, when demand falls relative to supply, the cost of something, you know, well, when demand follows relative to supply, essentially the price of that thing falls. When the price of government debt falls, the interest rate the government has to pay rises significantly. So interest costs are looking as though, for very long-term reasons to do with the structure of our savings industry, also going to rise very significantly. And at the moment, you know, where the cost of borrowing for the government is, you know, it's already ridiculously high, something like 100 billion plus, which is more than we spend on pretty much any public service apart from health. So, you know, all the pressures in the long term are moving against the stability of the public finances, the affordability of government's borrowing, and the politics of dealing with that are terrible. Right? You know, basically saying to the country that pensioners are going to have less in retirement, I mean, you know, that is the short way to electoral oblivion.
So what do you do?
Or telling people they're going to have to pay for their own health. That is the direction.
So we're in the Treasury. Let's talk specifics. What do we do?
I think
what's palatable? What could we get?
The first thing you've got to do is when the OBR puts out a report like that, every politician, of any party needs not to say, oh, God, they're talking about something that is 10, 20 years. Every politician should seize it and speak in public honestly and in a mature way to British voters, about the really difficult. This should not be something that is too difficult to debate, but it is too difficult. It has traditionally been too. People just think tomorrow never comes, but it is coming. And one of the things, just to prove my point, right? Just to be, Gordon Brown introduced fiscal rules in 1997. Now he made initially some relatively sort of difficult decisions on spending in the early 2 or 3 years and on money raising in the early 2 or 3 years. And for about 3 or 4 years, the national debt actually fell after he introduced those fiscal rules in 1997. But since then, the national debt has more or less risen every single year since the fiscal rules. And now, the fiscal rules are supposed to keep chancellors honest, but broadly, through the entire history of the fiscal rules, the national debt has been rising, which just shows you just the extraordinary upward.
I get all that.
Upward pressures.
Just to finish here, let's just finish with specifics because I'm interested in, I guess, your view that let's say she's got to get 20 billion, which is the figure that we've talked about in the budget.
Well, so again, can I just make one? So can I just sort of explain also the sort of nightmare that we face just in terms of the one budget, which, as I said to you, I don't think is as important as fixing the 2030 year problem. But right now, with this budget looming in the autumn, we know there's a hole, right? We know there's a hole. Yeah. But what we don't know is whether the hole is a few billion, right? Something a little bit more than maybe the 5, 6, 7 billion that she lost because of the U-turns on welfare reform and on the winter fuel and on extending the number of people who will get the winter fuel allowance, the U-turn on means testing. Yeah. So we don't know if it's that, or up to the assessment made by the National Institute comparatively recently, whether it's something like 60 billion. Now, I, in a not very scientific way, have said, well, maybe split the difference, maybe it's 20 billion. But that's a lot of money.
Yeah,
right?
Well, it is a lot of money, yeah. So let's talk about that very specifically. And then what I want to ask you about the long term is what you consider inevitable changes. So let me put both to you in one go. 20 billion is a lot of money. As I said, kind of things she's obviously going to be thinking about. I don't think she's going to be thinking about wealth taxes. I think she's going to think about, putting fuel duty up. I'm interested to know whether you think that's just too much grief. Is it an idea you discuss and then back off? Freezing income tax allowances, personal tax allowances is an easy way to raise quite a lot of money. It always seems to me to be the least controversial way to raise money from the masses, but maybe you disagree with that.
Sorry, which one?
Freezing tax allowances.
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's just because it doesn't come up as a headline that you've increased tax, even though in fact you have. She obviously can't put up income tax. She can't put up VAT because she said in her manifesto that she's not going to do that. Do you think... I don't think it's very likely she's going to equalise capital gains and income tax because that has a lot of business and investors would scream and shout about that, which might be, given that she hasn't got the growth she wanted, that might be problematic. What does your nose tell you she's likely to do or where she's likely to look? And I haven't even mentioned kind of potentially changing the laws around pensions. There's been a lot of discussion about the tax-free lump sum, whether she changes that, whether she talks, changes the pension relief. What does your nose tell you she'd be looking at?
My nose tells me that because of their manifesto commitments, which they insist they're going to honour, they will end up doing something messy that will again fight against their growth ambitions, right? So putting up employers' national insurance, they felt they had to do because they needed a large sum of money in the last budget. That was 25 billion. And it was the only route that they could take while persuading themselves that they weren't breaking their manifesto which said not going to put up income tax, not going to put up corporation tax or VAT. Now, they also said we're not going to raise national insurance. They didn't say we're not going to raise employers' national insurance. When you read it, it looked as though they weren't going to raise either employers or employees. They then insist that there were some weasel words in the manifesto about not hitting working people, which is why they insist to this day that they haven't breached their manifesto by putting up employers' national insurance. But to be clear, putting up employers' national insurance is a jobs tax. And if you want to grow the economy, you don't put up... Sorry?
They can't do that again. They can't put that up again, surely.
No, they're not going to put up... No, hang on a second. They're not going to put up employers' national insurance. But what I'm saying is that the kind of things you've talked about, given that we are not yet anywhere near being a fast-growing economy. We're still bumping along the bottom as the way we have been for 15, 16 years. Living standards are not rising enough. They are rising, to be clear. Wages are rising faster than inflation, but not fast enough for vast numbers of people to feel the stagnation of their living standards and the erosion, during the Great Inflation period has, really been corrected. And so... but so much of what you've said would just fight against growth and investment. Yeah. So, they have a dilemma there and would also, look, let's just take one example, right? Historically, whenever chancellors have needed money, they've raided the tax breaks on pension contributions or, what we take out of our pensions. And that has been a sort of basically a seemingly bottomless purse for chancellors for years because the tax subsidies have been significant. And she could do more on that. She could do something that was rumoured before the last budget, which was to, for those who are paying higher rates of tax, basically say the tax allowance is now only going to be the basic rate of tax. The problem with that is that people who do not think of themselves as being very high earners, so even senior nurses, senior teachers, head teachers, would have happened because of the technicality of it, they'd suddenly find themselves paying 40% tax for the first time, because the advantage of this system is that it keeps many of those people in the, basically paying the lower rate of tax. The reason the last budget, the Chancellor shied away from doing that was because she didn't want to be seen to be punishing a lot of people who were basically Labour supporters. But there is a more fundamental problem with increasing the taxation that people pay, whether it's on lump sums or whether it's on their contributions, which is, I've just said in the my earlier discourse about how we've got these terrible problems of an ageing society. When you've got an ageing society and you think that state provision through the basic pension, for example, can't possibly keep up with people's needs, you want people to make more private provision. You put taxes up on private pension contributions, and that's not going to happen. Yeah. So this is another example of the long-term needs of society fighting against the Chancellor's need for cash in the short term. And, at some point, we need grown-up politicians who tell voters the truth about the long-term pressures we face. It is literally mad that, as you implied, that we have written into law the idea that petrol should go up. There's this fuel duty escalator. Yeah. It's written into law. Every single budget, the Chancellor announces that the escalator is not going to be implemented because they're terrified of putting up the cost of petrol for voters, despite the fact that the overwhelming evidence is that that among the measures you could take to encourage people to spew less carbon dioxide and poison into the atmosphere would be to reduce consumption of petrol, put up the price of petrol. Nonetheless, no Chancellor in modern times has had the guts to do that.
Finally, then, just briefly, let's talk about the long term. And, in a way, I wonder if the Chancellor really wanted to make her name, maybe what she should do is a really big bang budget that does address some of these questions.
But she did it in November.
Yeah, but it didn't.
It was 40 billion flipping quid, and the extraordinary thing is, to be honest, I do not believe that we are now in a place where any one budget can reconfigure the public finances in a fundamental way for the long term. The only thing that can deal with this is an honest national debate about the choices that we as a society want to make. And it requires a degree of bold political leadership that I don't think that we definitely haven't seen in this country probably since Margaret Thatcher. You need a leader who basically is prepared to be A, incredibly unpopular, and B, do some really radical things, recognizing that we have these twin problems, and they are the fundamental problems. We are not growing fast enough. And that means with limited resources, you have to allocate those resources specifically to the kind of initiatives that might get the growth rate up. And you might, in the short term, have to say, well, that does mean that there will be less money for, some of the projects that we'd like to have money spent on. But frankly, we're just going to have to make do with a slightly more second-class service in some areas. That's number one. And number two, we are going to have to rethink where you draw the lines of private provision and public provision. And if we're not prepared to have that debate, in the end, British people might decide they want a slow-growing economy funded by very high levels of taxation. But at least let them know that is what they're facing.
Okay, these are very, very big questions. We'll come back to them. That's all for now. If you haven't already, do hit subscribe on YouTube or on any podcast platform to make sure you never miss an episode. We'll be back on Friday answering your questions on Talking Politics Q&A. Until then, thank you for joining us.